you for that introduction, Paul. Welcome, everyone. This is our first event of the day. This will be a roundtable on the theme Global Catastrophic Risks in a Changing World. As Paul mentioned, my name is Dan Zimmer. I am currently a lecturer at Stanford's Civics, Liberal, and Global Education program, and I'm a very proud alumnus of the SERI postdoc program. The way this will work is we've got three very illustrious people. I will introduce them. They will then have about 5 minutes to say a little bit about themselves and their work, to introduce themselves to one another and to all of you. And then we'll open things up to discussion. I'll have a couple prompting questions for them, but the goal really is to have a kind of horizontal discussion between these experts in different domains and to open up the floor for questions from the audience. So with that in mind, I'll begin with Dr. Rupal Mehta. Dr. Mehta is Chair of Research and Postdoctoral Fellows Program and Senior Fellow at the Center for Global Security Research at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. She is an Associate Professor, currently on leave, in the Department of Political Science at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Previously, she was a Stanton Nuclear Security Postdoctoral Fellow in the Belfer Center's International Security Program and the Project on Managing the Atom at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. Her research interests lie in international security and conflict, with a specialization in nuclear proliferation, counterproliferation, extended deterrence, emerging technologies, and elite decision-making. Her first book, Delaying Doomsday: The Politics of Nuclear Reversal, out from Oxford in 2020, explores the conditions under which nuclear aspirants stop their pursuit. Her work has appeared in the Journal of Conflict Resolution, International Studies Quarterly, the Journal of Strategic Studies, the Washington Quarterly, and her commentary has appeared in the New York Times, Washington Post, NPR, BBC News, War on the Rocks, International Studies Quarterly, and the Washington Post's Monkey Cage. She received a PhD and MA in political science from the University of California, San Diego, and BA in political science from the University of California, Berkeley. Dr. Drew Endy is a science fellow and senior fellow by courtesy at the Hoover Institution. He leads Hoover's biosecurity and leadership efforts, which focuses on keeping increasingly biotic futures secure, flourishing, and democratic. Professor Endy also researches and teaches bioengineering at Stanford University, where he is the Martin Family University Fellow in Undergraduate Education, a senior fellow, also by courtesy, of the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies, and faculty co-director of degree programs for the Hasso-Plattner Institute of Design. Professor Endy helped launch new undergraduate majors in bioengineering at both MIT and Stanford, and the International Genetic Engineered Machines, iGEM, competition, which involves thousands of students annually. Endy has served as the U.S. National Science Advisory Board member for Biosecurity, the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering and Medicine Committee on Science, Technology, and Law, the International Union for Conservation of Nature's Synthetic Biology Task Force, and briefly, the Pentagon's Defense Innovation Board. He currently serves on the World Health Organization's Advisory Committee on Variola Virus Research, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, Global Forum on Technology and Synthetic Biology Task Force, and the Defense Science Board's Emerging Biotechnology and National Security Task Force. Endy earned his PhD from Dartmouth in biotechnology and biochemical engineering and has been recognized in Esquire magazine as one of the 75 most influential people of the 21st century. Rob Lempert is director of the Frederick S. Pardee Center for Longer Range Global Policy and the Future Human Condition, a principal researcher at RAND, and a professor of policy analysis at the Pardee Rand Graduate School. His research focuses on risk management and decision-making under conditions of deep uncertainty. Lempert's work aims to advance the state of the arts for organizations managing risk in today's conditions of fast-paced, transformative, and surprising change, and help organizations adopt these practices to make proper stewardship of the future more commonly practiced. He is a fellow of the American Physical Society, a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, coordinating lead author for Working Group 2 of the IPCC Sixth Assessment Report, a chapter leader for the Fourth U.S. National Climate Assessment, chair of the peer review panel for California's Fourth Climate Assessment, a member of California's Climate Safe Infrastructure Working Group. He has also been a member of numerous study panels for the U.S. National Academies, including America's Climate Choice and Informing Decisions in a Changing Climate. Lempert was the inaugural EADS Distinguished Visitor in Energy and Environment at the American Academy of Berlin, and the inaugural president of the Society for Decision Making Under Deep Uncertainty. He is an author of the book Shaping Our Next 100 Years, New Methods for Quantitative Long-Term Policy Analysis. He holds a PhD in applied physics from Harvard University. Our fourth panelist, Jackie Schneider, unfortunately could not be here. So with that, I'll turn things over to you to say a little bit about your work, about 5 minutes, and in the order I introduced you.
Well, thank you, Dan, for that kind introduction, and I also want to thank the organizers of the SERI conference for inviting me to speak here today. I want to note that I am speaking in my personal capacity, as these are my own views on these issues. I am not speaking on behalf of Lawrence Livermore National Lab, the National Nuclear Security Administration, or the Department of Energy, or any other federal agencies. I am honored to be included in this roundtable discussion to talk about some of the challenges and risks we face today in nuclear security, and unfortunately, they are significant ones. In my brief remarks today, I'm going to highlight 4 topics that I think deserve some extra consideration and some of the ongoing research that seeks to address it. First, we stand at a precarious juncture where the very foundations of nuclear security are being challenged. The erosion of trust, particularly the perception of abandonment by allies, fuels a dangerous cycle. While nuclear nonproliferation was one of the core pillars of the rules-based liberal world order, we are starting to see some very serious cracks emerging. When states feel their security guarantees are unreliable, they are more likely to pursue independent nuclear capabilities. And in recent weeks, we have already seen allies such as Poland, South Korea, and others openly explore the value of developing an indigenous nuclear weapons deterrent apart from any extended deterrent commitment by the United States. This unrestrained proliferation creates a far more complex and volatile strategic environment. In this environment, regional conflicts can be amplified by now multiple nuclear-armed actors, each with their own unique security concerns. This is not theoretical. It's a direct consequence of a perceived inconsistent and perhaps unreliable commitment by nuclear patrons. My own research suggests that some avenues for creating credibility-enhancing mechanisms within alliances can help to curb the likelihood of reckless behavior by allies in disputes and potentially reduce incentives for nuclear proliferation. But no doubt, many serious questions remain about whether we will enforce our alliances and our partnerships. Demonstrate unwavering resolve and reestablish the credibility of our security commitments to dissuade that type of proliferation. Second, in a world rife with tension, the risk of misperception and inadvertent escalation to the use of nuclear weapons is alarmingly high. Communication breakdowns, technological errors, or misreading an adversary's intentions can have catastrophic consequences. In the nuclear age, a single miscalculation can trigger a chain reaction leading to global devastation. Consider the rapid decision-making required in a crisis. With cyber attacks, disinformation campaigns, and other forms of disruptive emerging technologies, the potential for misinterpretation is amplified. This is likely to be especially salient in the midst of crises, as actors are looking for off-ramps for de-escalation or can perversely leverage this uncertainty to press their claims further. Specifically, it is necessary to better understand how different actors are reacting to this escalation of risk and what this might mean for policy outcomes. And if we can indeed predict how different actors will respond to these stimuli, fear, uncertainty, anger, and now vengeance, and high-risk decision-making contexts, can this help conflict resolution outcomes? Robust communication channels, clear red lines, and a strategy for de-escalation embedded within our own strategic thinking will be increasingly important in this complex decision-making environment. Third, despite the urgency of the nuclear threat, especially in a two-peer nuclear environment, recent efforts at strategic risk reduction and arms control have stagnated and in many cases regressed. Key treaties such as New START are set to expire in the next year, and new arms races in the nuclear, conventional, and emerging technology domains are surfacing. This is a profound regression at some of the remarkable efforts at arms control throughout the Cold War and post-Cold War eras. It will be increasingly important to reconsider this trajectory and work to rebuild some of the tools that have kept the international community safe for decades. As noted by some of my colleagues at CGSR at Lawrence Livermore National Lab, this might include revitalizing arms control dialogues, exploring new avenues for risk reduction, navigating and regulating new and emerging technologies that can blur the lines between conventional and nuclear conflict. These efforts may aim to be cooperative and certainly aim to include buy-in from all the nuclear powers, but unilateral restraint may also be increasingly appealing in the current security environment. Most importantly, states must seek to establish a framework for stability and reducing the likelihood of catastrophic conflict. The current trajectory points to increased instability. It's critical that we reverse this course. Finally, recent research reveals the limitations of focusing solely on an adversary's capabilities. Understanding adversarial intentions is equally crucial. This will require sophisticated intelligence gathering, nuanced diplomatic engagement, a robust research agenda, and a willingness to engage in dialogue even with those we disagree with. Recent research, including some of my own, has sought to move beyond sort of simple state-level explanations and to recognize the complexities of strategic decision-making. What drives adversaries' actions? What are their core security concerns? How do adversaries' leaders perceive our own actions? What type of domestic politics might be driving their decision-making? Without a deep understanding of these factors, we are operating in the dark and perhaps prone to miscalculations and misjudgments. New survey experiments that leverage elite perspectives on foreign policy, public opinion regarding nuclear use, or even my own work on exploring subjects' brains using MRI under nuclear scenarios that exacerbate fear and stress represent new frontiers in developing better logics and testing new theories about the causes and consequences of nuclear weapons in the international system. The central paradox of nuclear security is precisely that normatively desirable outcomes have limited variation. As noted by my dear friend Eric Gartsky, quote, "Good news has meant both that the nuclear holocaust has been avoided and that we cannot be sure how best to avoid it in the future." In this increasingly challenging global security environment, it has become even more important to continue to navigate peacefully around this paradox, continue our scientific efforts aimed at preventing the spread and use of nuclear weapons, while working to ensure peace and stability in our global community. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Let me make 4 points. When I wake up in the morning, I'm a naive optimist, and I think about flourishing. And for me, the physics of flourishing are really good. And what I mean by that is that I can imagine a future where we could enable 10 billion Homo sapiens to provision joules, bits, and atoms sufficient to have a good life where they are. And photovoltaics helps a lot with that for the joules, the energy. And biology operates at the intersection of the joules and the bits and the atoms. And so we're going to have to get fully deployed biotechnology in a form that nobody's seen yet, distributed all over the planet to get this job done. And I want to get it done by or before the year 2050. Now, when I talk like this, other people react differently. When I was in Washington in 2003 advocating for investments in DNA synthesis, the ability to print DNA from scratch, rather than getting a $100 million program funded from DARPA, I got all public funding for DNA synthesis cut to zero. I got negative money. And that was because of my naivete around risk, having to do with the anthrax attacks and other things related to bioterror. And that continues. So when Mark Warner, the senator from Virginia, comes to visit, he looks at me and he says, "You're the scariest person I've met." And I wake up and again say, I don't aspire to be that person, Senator. But there are risks in bio, as we know. The thing that took out a US carrier group was an RNA virus. It wasn't a ballistic missile. Right? The thing that killed of order 10 million people was an RNA virus. The thing that killed hundreds of millions of people last century was smallpox. So we know that there are risks in bio. We also know that we can heroically overcome some of them, right, through a vaccine eradication campaign for a pox virus. If I look today and going forward about risk in biology with an eye towards existential, there are increasing risks. We have an increasing threat surface. The number of things that biorisks can come at us via are going up. A good colleague and friend on campus, Mike Fischbach, with his team, recently bioengineered microbes that live on the skin to, if you will, tickle the immune system to create an immune response. This work is done in mice. The initial application is to vaccinate mice against melanoma. So you could have a living skin cream that protects you against skin cancer. No needles, no syringes, sounds pretty good. But what else could you do if you could tickle people's immune system through microbes on the skin? interesting to think about. We also have interesting upgrades in capacities. I read yesterday a neat paper, a preprint, that had just been posted from a research group in Shanghai, where they have a new method for building DNA from scratch. They have a whole center focused on getting better at building DNA. Finally, somebody's doing that, just not in the United States. And according to their preprint, they're now able to use the classical chemical synthesis method for DNA to build fragments that are just under 1,000 letters long, 600 to 1,000 letters, about the size of a gene. The nerd in me is pretty excited. We also, as mentioned, have heard about artificial intelligence. Another good colleague at Stanford, Brian He, trains large language models not on English, but on nucleic acid sequences. And so a so-trained model, when you prompt it, emits nucleic acid sequences. Right now, these are interestingly useful at generating molecules, proteins or so, that are functional. But the latest work in his lab is getting to small genome scale, right? And it's looking like that might work sooner than I would have expected. So there's upgrades in terms of who can do what where with biology. Another thing to note is, even though last month, I think, was the 50th anniversary of the Biological Weapons Convention, and I don't know of a nation state that publicly brags about having offensive biological weapons programs, for the last 3 or 4 years, I see increasing chatter between nation states accusing one another of having offensive biological weapons programs. So China is accusing the United States. Russia is accusing Ukraine and the United States. The United States is accusing Russia, and so on. That's new to me. I don't remember that happening 5 or 10 years ago. If a nation state remilitarizes biology with the tools we have and are coming, nothing good comes from that. So existential to what? It's pretty easy to imagine biology being an existential risk to democracy. What's the casualty rate you have to get to until you get authoritarian government? Not that high. I think we know that. Biology existential to civilization? Probably. What's the casualty rate you have to get to where you just can't operate the civilization anymore? And what we heard in the opening comments about the connections of things rings true to me. Biology existential to Homo sapiens? I don't see it. I don't think you can take out the species. That's pretty hard. But the other two things are important enough to me that I don't need to go that far in my thinking. The last thing I'll offer as a comment is the narrative structure. What's the story we're telling about ourselves and our future? And I think there's a whole other category of existential risk that just has to do with the stories we tell each other. I was recently in Bangalore and Mumbai leading a biotech delegation. There was not one conversation about biosecurity in that whole week in India. They got other things that are higher priorities. It'd be a luxury to worry about biosecurity. Right. When I go to DC next week for the launch of the National Security Commission on Emerging Biotech Report, what's going to be the story? Part of the story is we're going to want to keep our leadership position in biotech, make sure China isn't ahead of us. That's actually the wrong story. In my view, we're already behind, right? So like, The other part of the story is, are we telling a positive story? And if we can't bring ourselves to tell a positive story and fill that in, good luck. I'm really jealous, actually, of I'm looking forward to talking about this, the culture and storytelling around nuclear security, because somehow in that domain, people have been capable of becoming heroes. Whereas in biosecurity, I think people who are inside the space know who the heroes are, but the broader community doesn't, and so that means there aren't heroic career paths for people to solve these existential problems. Thanks very much. Looking forward to the discussion and questions.
Thanks. Thanks for the introduction. Thanks all for being here. It's a real pleasure for me to be here and be part of this panel and this conference. So I want to just talk a little bit about two things related to add to the discussion. One is this Global Catastrophic Risk Assessment Report that RAND put out last year that Paul mentioned, and then a set of ideas and methods that are central to a lot of my work and help support that report, called Decision Making Under Deep Uncertainty, which I think are very relevant to the topics we're discussing today. So to start with the GCRA, the Global Catastrophic Risk Assessment Report, Congress asked Department of Homeland Security and FEMA to coordinate an assessment of global catastrophic and existential risk relevant to the United States over the next 30 years. And they sort of toss that over the transom, and because RAND runs a federally funded research and development center for DHS, they tossed it over to us. And about 20 of us wrote this report, including Ed Geist was one of who you'll hear from later, is one of the team on this. We started actually by developing frameworks for trying to think about this, and focused on assessed risks in 6 areas: artificial intelligence, asteroid and comet impacts, nuclear war, extreme climate change, pandemics, and supervolcanoes. So that was our palette that we were supposed to work with. Lots and lots of interesting questions, most of which I'll dance over very quickly, but just mention a variety of really interesting definitional issues, which Paul mentioned and also been mentioned here. Existential risks involve essentially human extinction or permanent, unrecoverable end of human potential, is the language that some use. A catastrophic risk is one which, I think this was the language of the legislation, significantly harms or sets back human civilization at a global scale. So, how do you decide what goes in those buckets? There's numeric numbers. I think Paul, you stuck up 1 billion. Some use the number 10 million. Billion may be high. Problem with 10 million is we lose something like 30 million people a year to cancer and cardiovascular disease. So there's some novelty that goes along with the number. So we could spend the whole day on that topic. In the report, we ended up using the 10 million mortality criteria and then a number of other criteria as well, so essentially multi-objective. There's a whole fascinating set of issues having to do with primary and secondary effects. A difference between catastrophic and existential risk is the permanence, which means you need to think about what can you recover from, what sorts of shocks lead to civilization collapse, and if that happens, can civilization come back or not? What sorts of civilization collapse lead to extinction versus other futures, all of which is well in the category of deeply uncertain and a low evidence base, so difficult to engage with. So in this report, we engage on the primary effects. What I want to spend a little bit of time on is the very interesting question, to me at least, is how do you compare across these risks, right? And sort of the classic way we all learn in our first class on this is we calculate the probability of the hazard, look at the consequence, we multiply it, we get a number, we rank the numbers, and we say, oh, that one's high, let's pay attention to that one, right? And that is, in fact, what the legislation sort of suggested that we do. And that is, while there's some shades of that, that's not really what the report does. There's really not a primary focus on estimating probabilities, quantifying consequences, and multiplying them. And in the end, we thought that would obscure a lot more than it would reveal, in part because these risks are all very different levels of types of processes, levels of evidence, and so forth. Just think about the difference between thinking about an asteroid and what, say, Mr. Putin's going to do with his nuclear weapons. And those are quite different levels of processes and thought and evidence bases. But also, although the risks are very different, there's lots of commonalities in the ways you might want to deal with them. So what we chose to do instead is treat this risk assessment as an exercise in this field of decision-making under deep uncertainty. And just to say a little bit about that here, it's a set of decision analytic methods which aim to answer the question, how do we conduct rigorous policy analysis in a fast-changing world where the only certainty is surprise, and not incidentally, people have contested values which then interact with their expectations about the future. Some people stick wicked problems on a set of these issues. So how do you do policy analysis in that vein? So part of the DMDU idea is, while much risk and policy analysis focuses on predictions in these worlds of deep uncertainty, when surprise is certain, prediction-based analysis can sometimes get in the way and exacerbate broken conversations between experts, decision makers, and the public. Essentially, if you're in a prediction-based form, it encourages the experts to be a lot more overconfident than they actually are about what they think is going to happen, because the whole communication line is you need to be a good predictor in order to have anything to be listened to. So you end up breaking the conversation between experts, public, and decision makers. So what you do instead is really turn the analysis around, and you use your analytics to stress test plans or alternative plans and ask questions. Plans have goals. Under what conditions, types of futures is my plan consistent with my goal? Under what sorts of futures does my plan inconsistent with my goal? If I've got completing plans, under what sorts of futures do the plans, A better than B, B better than A, or we can't tell? That information, which is often much higher confidence than what's going to happen, can be brought into ideally co-designed participatory processes where people use their analytics and their creativity, their knowledge of the systems to work with the experts to come up with new plans which are more robust, resilient, often adaptive, that then when you run them back through the stress tests, do a lot better than what you started with. So that's the essential idea. So the GCRA report was really an assessment and to get all the way to policy, but it was inspired by the ideas. It was very inherently multi-objective. We looked at different categories of consequences: mortality, ecosystem instability, social instability, and reduced human capacity, which was on the list, not solely, but in large part because of AI. We may be, physically well, but lose all our agency, and so that also represents a catastrophic risk in this lexicon. So for each of these very different risks, we ask a common set of questions. What are the processes, the causal chains that would produce risk? What are the potential categories, consequences in each of the four categories? The types of actions that can reduce risk, either by intervening in the causal chain that causes them and breaking the chain, reducing the risk, or reducing the consequences. And then what's the evidence base for all these assessments? And so, we have wonderful chapters, a brilliant one written by Ed, that basically follow this structure, and then a bunch of tables that allow you to compare on that. So what do we find? Of course, we need a bottom line assessment. So global catastrophic risk is going up in recent years. For supervolcanoes and the extraterrestrial impacts, asteroid comet strikes, the risks should remain constant, or in fact be going down, in large part because we're making some progress on being able to observe and maybe respond to asteroid comet approaching Earth. For the others, human action appears to be increasing the risk. Not surprisingly, AI is the one where it's hardest to say anything definitive about the sign. Four key factors contribute to these risk increases: technological change, failure of governance, and we particularly railed on failures of international governance, though we might rail on other things today. Failure to advance human development, so dissatisfied people, and interactions among these different hazards. Have a list of recommendations. Do a better job of incorporating comprehensive risk assessment into the management of these risks. Research to both reduce uncertainties but also improve understanding needed to do a better job managing the risks. Improved international cooperation. When sufficient evidence is available, very specific risk management strategy, plans and strategies. This was for FEMA. And then to really embrace this idea that many of these risks are going to be set by irreducible uncertainties, and we have to adapt our planning approaches to deal with that. The stress test idea over a wide range of scenarios, emphasize robustness, resilience, adaptivity, dealing with systemic risks, and systems problems as a way to get across multiple risks, and actually having government and bureaucratic processes that are more resonant with those ideas. So thanks, and look forward to the discussion.
All right, thank you all very much for giving us a brief glimpse at what you're working on. As all of you probably know, when we're dealing with global catastrophic and existential risks, these are things that have tremendous consequences for humankind as a whole. Each particular risk could more than justify an entire life's work of working on it. You've got nuclear experts, people working in AI, biology. And one of the reasons that SERI exists is to provide a forum for people to break out of the silos and the kind of professional networks in which they usually operate and have these sorts of cross-cutting discussions. So for starters, I just wanted to see if, in light of having heard about what one another are working on, you have any immediate questions you'd like to ask.
Rupal, I'd like to just hear more about how you think about the intentionality of potential adversaries in a systematic way. I mean, how do you go beyond just the storytelling on that?
Yeah, I think this is probably the biggest question that we're facing in the nuclear security research environment right now. So historically, what we've done is used documents from leaders, we've looked at memoirs, we've looked at sort of primary source evidence to understand what types of things were going through their head in the midst of crises. I'm not sure that's satisfactory, in part because it's a retrospective analysis, and people in the midst of crises often think differently than what they reveal later in memoirs. So one thing I think has been very helpful, and there's actually people here in the audience and at CSEC that have done this type of work on public opinion, that have tried to sort of look at taking subjects from other decision-making environments or informational environments to understand how they're sort of approaching these things. I know that there's been work at Stratcom and other places to sort of have analysts that have deep expertise in Russian decision-making or Chinese decision-making, sort of embody that in the midst of scenarios, tabletop exercises, or war games. It's very challenging. I was telling Dan earlier that one of the things that we're trying to do at the lab is use AI in wargaming to sort of take all the data that we have on adversary intentions, look to see what has been published, look to see what has sort of been revealed over time, and see if the sort of AI tools can help us better understand. But this is the biggest challenge. I mean, we're not going to get, I don't think in my lifetime I'll have President Putin come into my office and sit down in front of our MRI and have us conduct an experiment on him. I think that would be quite alarming if that were to happen. Yes, but I think there are ways to sort of get at that a little bit better. And certainly I think when we have not been looking at it at all, we've been primarily focusing on capabilities, nuclear superiority, number of conventional weapons, deployable platforms. This other aspect of the crisis decision-making chain is equally as important.
I have a question for both of you. What if Hiroshima had never happened? How would we be thinking about nuclear strategy or nuclear security differently? And for some of the types of existential risks, we haven't experienced them. We're aware of their possibilities. We know that asteroids come in, but like hasn't happened in the lifespan of our civilization. And so I'm curious if there are, if you do a deletion test on Hiroshima, right? Are there any insights we might take from the impact on what followed to get to strategy and Stratcom and NSA and all these things? So any reaction or thoughts to that prompt?
You want to go first? Well, I'm going to generalize the question, but if you want to do yours first, go ahead.
I think this is really interesting, but I think we've made some progress in understanding that, in part because we've been surveying younger folks that obviously don't have any knowledge of it firsthand. They do not remember hearing even stories from grandparents or parents about this. And if you ask them, have nuclear weapons ever been used in the international system? Their answer is no. Or they have very limited knowledge of the horrific impacts of the atomic weapons attacks in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. What I think that tells us is there's very little nuclear knowledge that is being passed through generations. We talk a lot about this at the lab, especially in our training of next generation programs, which is nuclear IQ or security IQ is quite low amongst our population. A lot more work needs to be done to raise that IQ to make sure people are aware of not just nuclear weapons attacks, but nuclear crises like the human missile crisis, to make sure they understand that these have almost happened, and in some ways, understanding why they did not is similarly as important. But no, I don't have a good answer for you other than I think we're approaching a time when a lot of people will not know the details of those attacks.
No, I think that's a great question because, I think the generalization of it is something that, I find terrifying, actually. In the resilience literature, there's the, sort of the creation destruction cycles, the observations that, failure breeds success because you respond to it, but success breeds failure because you get careless. I attended a great talk years ago by Henry Petrowski, the engineer who writes on this theme, and just one of these things that sticks with me forever. But he basically, through a wonderful slideshow, shows how over 2 generations engineers forgot how to keep suspension bridges up. Roebling was the first one to make a suspension bridge stand up the Brooklyn Bridge, wrote a manifesto. There were 3 things that you needed to do to get the bridge up, and then Petrowski goes through and he shows you all these bridges that then people built that only had 2 out of the 3 because it was cheaper or prettier, then 1 out of the 3, cheaper, prettier, and then we've all seen the movie of the Seattle-Tacoma Narrows Bridge, which had the first bridge that was built in like 2 generations that had 0 of Roebling's 3 principles, right? And no one involved in that process had ever seen a suspension bridge fall down or had ever studied with someone who saw a suspension bridge fall down. So it took 2 generations for the engineering profession to forget how to keep a bridge up. If you sort of look across disciplines, we've had a lot of stability in the world, and there's like do this to keep from having civilization-wide disasters. And we said, oh, we've gotten along pretty well. We can take this one out, we can take this one out. We're sort of pulling the pillars out one by one. And so that's sort of my generalization of your question, and it worries me.
Well, if I may ask you a related question, Dr. Endy. I know there are some people who think that the nuclear taboo that's held, that whether or not there's a nuclear taboo is debatable, but to the extent that there is, it's perhaps in part inspired by the horror of seeing the human aftermath of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But what if an attack on that scale there was deep uncertainty as to whether that was human-caused or natural? An asteroid strike has been shown to cause similar levels of devastation. What if there were a global pandemic, per se, that some people in high levels of the American government believe may have been caused in a lab versus having emerged naturally? What does that sort of ambiguous warning shot do for a field?
Where did SARS-CoV-2 come from?
I am not qualified to answer. I will defer to your judgment and not ask you to say anything that would be professionally compromising.
So it's a good question. We've all asked ourselves that question. We've all been asked that question. What's a better question? Better question might be, sort of picking up on some of your own, why have we made it hard to answer the question? Right? This is, in my view, a major policy failure in biosecurity policy of the 2010s. It goes back a little bit earlier, but it's a major policy failure that we've not made it easy to answer a question. So what are the costs of that, I guess, is your question. Collapse of trust. The collapse of trust is going to lead to new laws, new executive orders, not allowed to do this, not allowed to do that, not allowed to get funding to work on antiviral. I mean, like, just cascades. Yeah. So basically nothing good comes from that. It's not fair to use smallpox as an example because smallpox has been eradicated. But if you wanted to look at how smallpox research is governed, the answer is no. Don't do it. Right? Unless you can make a convincing case to a multilateral international body that you have to do the research to make a needed improvement to a diagnostic treatment or vaccine. And only then can you get a permission slip to do the work, and only then you should do the work in one of 2 labs that get inspected every other year by a multilateral group. Now, are other people working on smallpox? Probably, maybe, you know, but geez Louise, if smallpox came out tomorrow, hopefully not, we'd have an easier time figuring out, did it come from the 2 labs we knew might be working on it, right? And so it's not a perfect example or solution rather, but it makes it a little bit easier to answer questions. And then if you can get to this, then you're back in the realm of struggling to create and sustain trust. And I don't know how to do security without trust and verification, right, on an international basis. And so this is, in my view, like the biggest puzzle at a nation-state level around biosecurity, and we've blown it. And it's not easy, and I'm hopeful that maybe in the current moment we'll be brave enough to propose some new ideas that prioritize trust over scientific freedom in a way that hasn't been true. It's baffling to me how hard it is to get people to punch through this puzzle. But anyway, here we are.
Let's see, thank you. So at this point, I'd like to open things up to the audience. I believe we have people with microphones. If you have any questions, in the back. Herb Lynn.
Thanks. Herb Lynn, CSAC and Hoover. My question goes to Rupal, where you said that you focused a lot on trying to understand intent. And the way you did it was to look at the historical record, think about how AI might help, and so on, okay? And I agree that the forecasting of or the prediction of intent is really the one, really important, and 2, probably the hardest thing to do, much harder than understanding capabilities. My question is, of all of the methods that you use to understand and assess intent, how would you ever have anticipated somebody like Gorbachev against the backdrop of the former Soviet Union? Or Sadat in Egypt when he, was willing to sign a treaty with Israel, and so on. These to me are the major discontinuities that really shake things up, and major discontinuities seem to be the only way we can get a paradigm shift in any of this stuff. Please comment.
No, I think you're exactly right. And in my book, one of the things I tried to do when I was looking at nuclear reversal, so instances in which countries had developed nuclear weapons programs and then had stepped back away from that, maybe in response to offers to negotiate with the United States or with the European Union or whoever. And one of the things I learned is that it often comes on the heels of regime change. There might be a new leader that comes to power that is more willing to do that. And there are these windows of opportunity that might exist. But I think what you're talking about is a larger phenomena, which is basically these sort of isolated instances that are not matching the sort of overarching trends, but there are discontinuities or disruptions to those trends that are really important to understand. And here's where I think the intersection of domestic politics and international security is really critical. I think for a lot of our literature's history, we have siloed domestic political contexts from the study of how foreign policy is made or international security policy is made. And I think there's been recent efforts at trying to mirror some of the really great work in political economy, which does exactly that, Milner, et cetera. And we're trying now to understand domestic political changes on the ground, the emergence of sort of different types of political actors that come about, or there's a lot of fantastic work that looks at personal relationships between leaders like Gorbachev and some others in the United States. Or even, maybe we'll see this in the next couple of years, President Trump and President Putin, right? Two sort of different actors or idiosyncratic actors that have come together to have some sort of agreement or some sort of negotiation. These are not the sort of normal trends over time, but I think it is really important to analyze those. They're not gonna I don't think we're gonna be able to predict these. I think we can only sort of look at it in retrospect, but learning the context under which they come to power and how those agreements are formed or how those decisions are made, I think is equally as important as looking at sort of the long-standing trends over time. Probably not a satisfactory answer, but I'm part of this research agenda, but I'm not at the forefront of it, so I don't have a lot of good data for you. I'm not sure that data exists yet, but thank you for the question, Herb.
Yeah. I think if you think you live in a linear world, then discontinuities are a surprise. If you think you live in a complex system, then discontinuities are just part of the thing that the system does. In the climate world, where I spend much of my time, there's increasing interest in what are called tipping points, which is conceptually still fairly muddled. But the physical climate scientists, this is something that they are paying a lot more attention to as climate shift regimes, and as we're forcing the climate system harder, it's starting to do things which do look like tipping points. It had one stable, quasi-stable equilibrium, and you see it shift to other ones. And so in a physical, by physical way, that's a discontinuity. On the socio-political economic side, there's also, in the climate world, there's a lot more interest in tipping points, because if you're trying to, say, decarbonize the economy quickly enough to meet the Paris goals, that you need to force discontinuities in the system, and you're as a policy matter, you're trying to force a discontinuous change, and that whole understanding is a lot more muddled, but still, the question is like, how do we force a discontinuity, and then when we come out the other end, it's largely beneficial and doesn't have too many unintended side effects, which is a difficult problem. But again, I mean, in the system we live, discontinuities are part of the ecosystem of things that you would expect. They don't come as frequently as sort of the constant behavior, so they're harder to predict, particularly with the time series you may have. But it's part of the behavior.
Thanks. This has been super interesting. And before I say anything else, I want to just call out Drew's DNA socks. We have to wonder what gene is expressed on his socks. Great. So I ran a little workshop last week with my great French colleague Benoit Podobidas about the intersection among nuclear, climate, and authoritarianism. And one of the critics that was signed up to comment on our panel said, well, these are really different things, because nuclear war is an event, but climate change is a process. And we spent a while thinking about that afterward, and I think it's an interesting dichotomy, because you can recast both of them in the other light. So yes, a nuclear war is an event, but everything that has led up to it, the gigantic nuclear establishment we have, and all of that is a very long process that is directed toward that end. And then in the case of climate change, there's really a very substantial role of luck in whether people experience that personally or not in a catastrophic way. I mean, because we're getting extreme weather events that are, kill people, destroy their property, and they're happening with increasing frequency and intensity. Those people have experienced the risk Everyone else is just looking in from the outside. So I'm just kind of curious, especially for Drew, to talk maybe a little bit about bio and that, because you are also talking about the development of science over a very long period and the risks that, of kind of sudden breakout moments. But I'd be curious to hear all of you talk about process versus event.
Apparently there's a historical record from New England about when the stones fall through the frozen lakes. And it's a very long trail of data going back hundreds of years. And this is useful for ice fishing, right? Because when the stone falls through the ice, you don't go ice fishing anymore. And if you look at the historical record, there's noise in it, but the date on the calendar that the stone falls through the ice has been getting closer and closer to New Year's Day. It used to be late April, now it's March or February or something. And that's a climate trend or process. And it makes it very personal, makes it very local. My mom used to live in northern New Hampshire, up near Woodsville, and the winters be cold, -20 for a number of weeks. And because of that, the tick-borne diseases were suppressed. But over a period of time, starting around 2010 to 2020, started to get new tick-borne diseases, not just Lyme, but other stuff, until one day she fell ill with a disease I'd never heard about, and I always mispronounce it, but it's a tick-borne parasite, a microbe that infects your red blood cells like malaria. And so she was, as an 80-year-old, getting spiking fevers, and thank goodness azithromycin exists, right? And, but otherwise she'd be gone. And so, it's like I really like your question. And there's a little connection between climate and bio, right? Like suddenly we have malaria-like illness in northern New Hampshire. It just wasn't there in 2010. Coming back to your question and intersecting them, in a professional sense, and I'm sure this is true for other colleagues here, the COVID-19 pandemic was professionally depressing. It's hard to overstate how professionally depressing it was, because you could see the trends, and it must be like other areas where you can see the trends, you can see and then suddenly you have an event. Admiral Bernard's here. He did some work in 2004 proposing how to use emerging biotechnology to secure biology. Exactly right. It's 21 years later, we're still not doing it. It's not his fault. Right? It's like, it's our fault, right? This window of opportunity comment you made, big deal, right? Like, windows pop open, then they slam shut, and if you don't drive a bus through the window when it's open, good luck. We got something really heroic in National Security Memorandum 15, if I remember correctly, regarding pandemic resilience and biosecurity, had a vision statement. The United States of America creates a world free of biological catastrophe. I'm paraphrasing. That's good. Like, that's a good vision statement. That puts in motion a heroic narrative that can, if we drove a bus through that opening, sustain a campaign to get to something better. But to your point, if I take it, bioengineering is the youngest engineering department at Stanford. We're now 20 years old. When I first started teaching, the cost of building a gene was $4 a letter. Every letter on this sock is $4 when you go to print it into DNA. And now it's 4 cents, call it, if you buy enough, right? That's a change. My colleagues who build biosynthetic pathways are now building pathways that have 40 enzymes, right? That's up from one enzyme. That's the state of the art. You can access most biochemistry we know of in nature, right? Like, things are changing. We can see this. The next frontier is building cells. And Professor Relman, who I believe is here, and others have pointed out that some types of cells you could build might be a type of existential risk if you could build cells with opposite chemical chirality, so-called mirror life. And so, that's the next order of magnitude accomplishment, going from 40 component systems to 400 component systems. That'd be a cell. Like, that's the next, I think that's a $100 million project, right? that either is a lot of money or not a lot of money, depending on who you are, right? Building a cell, that next order of magnitude leap in integration of biomolecular componentry. And so you're like, yeah, we're rolling along, and we're mostly motivated from a Rousseauian perspective, and mostly is an understatement. We're almost exclusively motivated from a Rousseauian, like mitigate suffering, right? But we're not minding the gaps yet well enough on the risks that are emerging. And so when a pandemic shows up, it's not only personally, but it's like professionally horrific. And I'd like to get off that treadmill, and which is why I come back to what's the story we're telling, and how are we organizing ourselves? And if we cannot tell that correctly, that's a meta risk.
Yes, my name is Joshan Choi. I retired from Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, and also I was a former science fellow at the Center for International Security and Arms Control, as many of you know, which is the former name of the CSEC Center. I'd like to also contribute to these conversations on climate and nuclear, not looking in the nuclear weapon side of it, but looking in the civilian side of it. So for that, I would like to ask Dr. Mehta for a comment. As you know, for energy security, many countries, big or small, are going into the nuclear option. Many countries say they will not be able to meet, the Paris Accord without having nuclear in their energy portfolio. Having said that, the concern is not the energy part of it. The concern that I have is what is the outcome of that energy production, which is spent fuel. Spent fuel and nuclear weapons is one process away. We all well know. So currently we have 30-something countries that have spent fuel all over in the nuclear plant site. Ours included. We have 94 reactors. Many of the spent fuel is simply just sitting in the pool or in some dry cask. We have a long-term solution for that, put it into the geological. But for whatever the social objection, we have not been able to make any movement in getting some of those spent fuel together. And that would be the case if we have more than double that number of countries going to start building small modular reactor. Because 1 gram of spent fuel discharged from the reactor, you have that percentage of plutonium in it. So instead of looking into the adversary between these big, the 3 big countries that I always call, US, Russia, and China, I was trying to say, in light of talking about the risk, this is the future risk. We haven't seen it yet. Hopefully we'll not get there, but for many countries wanting to worry about climate and energy security, they jump onto the civilian nuclear fuel cycle and have the spent fuel littering all over the place. In Africa, currently have none of those. In Middle East. So would the 3 countries start thinking about this problem and how to cooperatively form some kind of a consortia to manage the spent fuel, existing one, and the future one, if there is any coming up, before we launch into the civilian nuclear economy? I'd like to hear your comments on that.
Thank you for that question. Yes, this is a major concern. And when we talk about the spread of nuclear latency or nuclear power, one of the big concerns we have is how can we deploy those technologies or have them proliferate without the concern of nuclear proliferation. I have a broader concern that I think sort of speaks to the potential decline of the non-proliferation regime in general, which I think has implications for the question you're talking about. I think if we start to see more proliferation from other countries, especially allies, I think the non-proliferation regime and the NPT in particular are going to be severely weakened. And what that also means is that our multilateral cooperative efforts to try to address export controls, spent fuel, safeguards for new nuclear weapon states, or even for civilian nuclear states will be severely limited. And that is a non-trivial possibility. I think that is something that has been discussed in many policy circles, and I think one of the things that we're going to be facing is what do these efforts look like without U.S. leadership? Will other countries decide to form other types of cooperative agreements like the ones you're talking about to provide assistance for spent fuel or to manage the spread of nuclear technology for either weapons or civilian purposes? And in a world in which the United States is no longer the global leader in this, I think we're going to have some very serious questions emerge about this. So your point is fantastic. I don't have any good answers for you other than I think I agree with you that this is something that is not yet happening but will soon happen.
Thank you. Dr. Lempert, do you have any systems-based wisdom to share?
Not on this one.
Thank you so much for the excellent comments, and my question is maybe more of a philosophical one. And to Dr. Endy's point, as somebody who's been working on agnostic biopreparedness for 20 years, it was gut-wrenching to go through the pandemic. We talked about multiple types of existential risk at this panel. We talked about supervolcanoes and asteroids hitting. We talked about nuclear. We talked about bio. My question is, why is the definition of trust so different in all three of them? Because you're talking about grandparents not telling the story of Hiroshima, but we lived through COVID-19. We are seeing the news about the evolution of things, and people are being affected today. We are seeing this, and we saw the impact of it. And yet the trust and moving forward on health-related issues is eroded. I mean, I agree with what you said, Dr. Endy, earlier, but the question is, why is that? Why are we not accepting things that we are seeing with face value? And why is our behavioral perception of each of those, to the earlier question about Gorbachev and others, I think there's a human element to this, but I'm not able to put my finger on why you're tripping and falling, but you're not accepting the fact that you fall. So the other aspect of this is the cost-benefit challenges, in terms of, say, DNA synthesis. We don't invest in it. We know the world is investing in it, and we know that someday it's going to come and haunt us. So there's a security element in protecting against it. Security is not locking things up, but preparing for it. And we always think about prediction and protection. We do not think as much about preparation as a community, especially in the health sector. So why is the human element of approaching these risks so different in each of those cases? And so it's maybe philosophical, but this is something I struggle with.
So I'll start on the first question. So I'm a political scientist by training, and so I always look for the politics everywhere, and I feel like this story is largely a political one. I mean, I think it's very politically beneficial for some actors, for some politicians to deny the value or to denigrate science. I think we saw that to be very effective during the pandemic and the elections that were surrounding that. And that erosion of trust, I think a lot of public opinion data has come out about the erosion of trust in science and in the healthcare industry, in your own physician, in public health officials. And that is, in my understanding, a very effective political tool that has probably one of the best, meaning like the most approximate manifestations of political polarization in the country.
No, clearly a great question. I want to push back a little bit on the premise. I don't think the underlying problem is different across these different areas, and I think there's a general erosion of trust, distrust of institutions, and so forth. I think there's a number of causes. I think Rupal, I think there's clearly political benefits to undercutting. There's the sort of the Marshall McLuhan schools, like of which Ezra Klein is like a major protagonist of the communication infrastructure has changed in ways that make it a lot easier to disseminate misinformation, form groups on misinformation, and that sort of thing. So the communication channels have fundamental changed. Being a climate person, also give a lot of credence to the materialistic, parts of the story where we're in the midst of the great acceleration. If you just, look, 10 times changes in GDP per capita over the last, couple of decades, taking an urban population and making it a rural population, making it urban, the massive changes in power between, inequality in both wealth and power has gone down between countries. It's gone up significantly within countries. We've got a whole set of institutions which were essentially created for a world about 70 years ago, which are we don't really have a good way to upgrade. We got creative destruction in the private sector, but not in the public sector. So and in a lot of ways, in this country, I think much across the the industrialized OECD, a lot of people feel like the system hasn't treated them very well over the last couple of decades. So, you've got a lot of reasons for, why people ought to be distrustful of institutions and experts. And I think that's part of the thicket that we, need to work our way through.
Really quick, it's a super provoking question in a good way. And I want to say that trust is the same, but your question highlights that we haven't figured that out, and we've got to figure that out. That's number one. Number two, sometimes you just have to meet people where they are. So it turns out that if you actually have conversations with folks about the types of vaccines they would like to have from a product design perspective, I bet 20 to 30% of people in the US want vaccines that are like Thanksgiving dinner, which is they make it themselves in their kitchen out of the best ingredients they can source, and they know there's no Wi-Fi chip in it because they didn't add it, right? And they'd be happy with that type of vaccine if you could make that safe, right? And then the third thing is, I was walking across campus some years ago, and there was a meeting happening over in Trettel, and there was a security perimeter around with armed guards with AR-15s. I was like, I've never seen that before. What's the meeting? And it was the Global Energy Forum. And so people are talking about energy. Why do you have to have a security perimeter? Because they're talking about power, political power. Like, oh, that's interesting. Why is that happening? Oh, because we're turning on the fourth modern energy empire. We had the wind empires of the past, then we had the coal empire, then we had the petroleum empire, which we're still in, but the renewable empire is coming on. And when you scratch on that, you start to learn things like the return on energy for photovoltaics went above 1 10 years ago, roughly, across the sector, meaning a panel generates more joules than it takes to make the panel. Right? Well, that's interesting. And so when I reflect on that, what emerges is I feel that we're operating in a bunch of what I call scarcity regimes, where we've learned how to maintain political stability under regimes of scarcity. But for the first time in human history, in a modern sense, abundance appears to be possible. Ezra Klein kind of is talking about it. He doesn't totally get it, but he's hitting at it, right? And we don't know how to do the politics of abundance. Nobody solved that puzzle. And so there's like one of my things, the scarcity regimes are gonna do their best to maintain stability, right? And it's like, okay. And can anybody figure out how to punch through that one?
I'm Ken Bernard. I'm at Hoover some of the time. COVID origins, I wanted to raise again. COVID origins, we don't know. We have full technical capability of determining the origins. We have, and the entire reason we don't know is China. They won't let us know. I think a lot of what happens in catastrophic preparedness for catastrophic events are entirely political and not technical at all. Almost entirely political. I wanted to, especially because we have somebody from RAND here who actually hinted that they avoided rank filing risks by, with a number. I haven't read the report, but I'm going to propose for dealing with catastrophic risks that you avoid metrics altogether. They're uncommon events with highly consequential outcomes that are almost entirely unpredictable as to which one is going to happen at what point in time. Who would have guessed that a routine, normal coronavirus would cause a pandemic? I mean, it's unpredictable. And back in the day following 9/11, we were told we had to figure out what the biologic risks were for attack on the United States as defense. And 4 or 5 people, most of whom you'd know, half of them are dead now, but they were smart at the time, sat around a table and just decided. And what were the risks we had to prepare for? So, smallpox, anthrax, all of that. And it was just fine. Did we spend the right amount of money on the right things? Probably not. But there was no other better method. Now we spend now $5 billion a year on biodefense. So we spend $50 billion. Did we prevent an attack? I don't know. We spent $50 billion trying to prevent an attack or preparing for an attack. I think we need to keep the preparation for catastrophic risks out of the area of trying to rank them. I think we need to deal with all of them simultaneously. It has to do the same thing to do with the COVID origins. There are 2 reasons we had the pandemic. Either it was a natural outbreak amongst animals through intermediates, eventually got to humans, or it came from a laboratory. We don't actually need to choose which one it was. Both of the reasons need to be dealt with. And I think whether it's live animal markets or whether it's bad laboratory practices or even intentional creation of a bad organism, those all need to be dealt with as a civilization. So I think the same thing goes with your whole group of potential catastrophic risks. I think in any way trying to make them compete with each other is a really bad move.
Well, thank you for that comment. We are coming down to our last 3 minutes or so, so I'd invite each of you to give a reply if you'd like, and that will be our roundtable.
Yeah, I mean, basically, yeah, I agree. We need to deal with all of them. Ranking on the risk side, I think, is not the way to go. You do need to allocate societal resources, and so in some sense, you want to turn the telescope around, and you want to allocate resources essentially, where you are going to have the most impact, but also the most impact given that you may be the most wrong in what's coming next, which leads you to a lot of, sort of resilience sorts of ideas, which actually gets back to the trust. A society that has more trust can act in cohesive ways to, on warning or when stressed, does better across wide ranges of these than one which tends to fragment under pressure. So, but yeah, I agree with your assessment.
I think it's a really interesting point, and I think there are 2 questions that came up as you were talking. The first is, how do we get the public to agree that all of these risks are equally important and need to be treated as such? I think there's pretty wide variation in that, just cross-sectionally, if you look at sort of public opinion data in the United States. And then second, going back to the sort of scarcity regime idea, we are living in times of austerity. I mean, budgets are rapidly decreasing, if not completely going away. So how do we get politicians, how do we get people, legislators, lawmakers, to actually care about the things that are going to be impactful or going to be important, given that I think they're going to say we can't focus on all of these at the same time? And I don't know the answers to either of those 2 questions, but I think they're going to be important for us to address moving forward.
2 thoughts I'm really grateful for from the conversation. One is the comment about Petrosky and suspension bridge design, and how do we remember. I'm thinking about if I never used the stereo in my car, I wouldn't know when it breaks. However, if I had the electronics operating the stereo be the same electronics that operate the brakes, then I wouldn't have to turn on the stereo, right? So there's interesting ways of interleaving testing and selection and persistence of knowledge. I really want to think more about that So I'm very grateful for that. I'm also very grateful for the comment about trust, and is trust the same or different across these other domains, these various domains? And I really do want to believe it's the same. It has to be. But like following up on that is something I'm really excited to pick on. Thank you.
Well, I think that's an excellent point to end on. Please join me in thanking our panelists.
And to avoid a traffic jam in our coffee room area, maybe go back first and enter that way and then come out this way. And we're going to open these doors. There's a lovely courtyard out here, and you're free to go outside and chat there.